Hello everyone, it's Steve with Aptera Owners Club. In this video, I want to talk a little bit about the total societal costs of car ownership, or the car-centric society we have. This is a article from the LA Times about the California high-speed rail system. This has been a much derided public transit system. And public transit systems, for various reasons in America, are way more expensive than in other countries. Maybe we'll get into that in a different video if you guys are interested. But infrastructure projects in Europe and China and Japan and other parts of the world, they cost way less for various reasons. But putting in high-speed rail in America is extremely expensive, and the longer it takes, the more expensive it gets. So here it is: the 171-mile starter segment is going to cost $22.8 billion. It brings up the total amount of this full system cost at $128 billion. So they're now estimating that it's going to cost $128 billion to build the full Los Angeles to San Francisco high-speed rail system. I mean, this is a great idea on paper, where there's a lot of transit between LA and San Francisco. And if you built the high-speed rail system and it was cost effective, it would get a lot of use, take a lot of cars off the road, a lot of airplanes out of the air. You know, that LA to San Francisco flight system is quite active. There's a lot of flights going back and forth. And you could replace a lot of that with high-speed rail, which is a lot better in terms of emissions and pollution and efficiency of energy movement. But this cost is a lot, and people balk at this price. They're like, whoa, $128 billion, that is insane. Like, what are we doing? This is the craziest idea ever. But people forget that there is a cost to the status quo as well. This is definitely expensive, and for various reasons, it could have been done way cheaper. But let's shelve that, and let's just think about the cost of not putting uh, public transit infrastructure in. So people see these costs and they're like, that is crazy. And they act as if there is no cost to our current car-centric system. And that is absolutely not the case. So there are lots of costs to driving. Okay, there's the obvious costs. The obvious costs are the cost of keeping up the roads, and the cost of fueling the vehicle, maintaining the vehicle, and owning the vehicle, and insuring the vehicle. Those are all costs that we think about instinctively, but there's a lot of costs that we don't really think about, and that is the cost of vehicle crashes. So vehicle crashes, 40,000 Americans are killed in vehicle crashes, and of course, with the American obsession with bigger and bigger vehicles, there's kind of an arms race to bigger vehicles, and bigger vehicles have more kinetic energy, release more energy, and are more dangerous in accidents. So the bigger the vehicle is, the more dangerous you are to everyone else. So if everyone drove smaller vehicles, we'd be less dangerous to everyone else. But because everyone wants to protect themselves and are self-interested, we want a bigger vehicle to protect ourselves, but it's at the cost of damaging those around us. And the we Almost 40,000 Americans are killed in vehicle crashes. There's a lot of financial damage, and that's not putting into cost these are just people that die in car accidents. There's a lot of people that are seriously injured in car accidents, and that doesn't, quite capture that. And so if you look at injuries, property damage, they total $500 billion in a year. And then there are quality of life valuations. If you count in like injuries and things like that, that's over $1 trillion. Okay, so that's a thing that people don't think about too often as a cost of uh, the vehicle culture that we live in. Then there's air pollution. So air pollution is the single largest contributor to premature deaths from air pollution, and we suspect there's about 60,000 deaths each year prematurely due to air pollution. And then there's climate change. I know this is somewhat of a political topic, although I don't think it should be a political topic, but has become one. But this is also, if you think of a cost for this, there is some small additional cost to the cost of climate change mitigation and things like that. And then there's noise pollution. And noise pollution has a lot of health effects, especially psychological health effects. But our brain and our body are very linked together, and that can cause increased risk for cardiometabolic diseases like diabetes and things like that, cardiovascular diseases, strokes, that kind of stuff, and obviously the psychiatric issues with noise pollution as well. Okay, so that is some of the hidden costs that we don't think about. There's another study that was published out of April 2021, and I'll link these studies in the description below. This one was a European study looking at the total costs of ownership, and they looked at the cost of travel. Like if this is a study out of Germany, and the typical German car travels about 15,000 kilometers per year. That's significantly less than the driving that an American car drives. And they figured out that the total lifetime cost of car ownership, um, so if you owned a car for 50 years, and that's not the same car, but if you own the same type of car for 50 years, it would range between um, $600,000 for Opel Corsa. I had no idea what an Opel Corsa was, so I looked it up. This is what an Opel Corsa is. It's basically a small economy car. To €1 million euros for a Mercedes GLC. So that's higher end car. And the share of this cost borne by society is about 41% to 29%. So between 40 and 30%, depending on the vehicle. The cost of society is a little bit higher as a percentage, not as an absolute value. So absolute value is still higher for the bigger car, about 5,000 pounds per year versus 4,600 pounds per year for the Opel Corsa. And so if you extrapolate that to the United States, how many cars does the United States have? So in 2021, there were about 280 million vehicles in the United States. So if you extrapolate that, so about $5,000, I'm going to do the calculation, 5,000 times 280 million, that is $1.4 trillion per year. That's if people drove like in Germany. Now, we know in America we drive a lot more than people do in Germany. So the cost in America being $1.4 trillion a year is probably significantly less than the cost in America is significantly more than $1.4 trillion. That $1.4 trillion is probably a very low estimate. All right, here's another one. This is looking just at air pollution costs, looking at data from 2008 to 2016. And what they found is that the total societal costs per year was approximately 1.84 billion, and the range, depending on their errors within their estimation, range from anywhere from 78 billion to 280 billion. And this is just for the air pollution costs. And how do they come up with this dollars? It's kind of another interesting tangent. So they looked at this, and they looked at what the statistical value of a human life was, and it's valued at around $9,217 US dollars. So adjusted to $217, inflation adjusted, is $9 million. And so how do they figure out the value of a human life? Seems kind of an asinine thing to try to ascertain, but this is something that government agencies do and a lot of companies do. And I heard about this first several years ago on this podcast called All Things Considered. And it's how government agencies determine the dollar value of a human life. It's kind of interesting how they figured it out. In this, at this time, they said it's about $10 million. And there's an economist based out of Vanderbilt University. His name is Kip Viscusi, and he's the guy who figured out the methodology. But don't blame him for it. I mean, he's just an economist. The way he did it was kind of clever. What he did is he looked at data for all kinds of jobs, and jobs that required extra wages to account for the increased risk of death. So he looked at a bunch of workers that are sort of at higher risk of job-related fatalities, and these are, construction workers, nurses, coal miners, lawyers. Okay, I'm not sure why the lawyers are in there, but anyways, they looked like nurses, like pre-coronavirus numbers, and they asked them, how much more did you have to pay nurses to get a more dangerous job, like working in the ICU with coronavirus patients? Or how much did you have to pay coal miners to work the more dangerous jobs than they would have otherwise? And if you look at that and you average out all the data, you can kind of figure out how much people are valuing their own lives. So if you say that if you pay me an extra $400 a year, and my chance of dying by taking that job increases by 1 in 25,000, then you've essentially put a value on your own life. And if you do all the data across the United States and see how much people are willing to work a more dangerous job for, you kind of come out with this number that's about $10 million. So people are sort of valuing their own lives by seeing how much money they'll take for a more dangerous job at about $10 million. So that's how they come up with these numbers, which I think is kind of fascinating, actually. There is another paper that was done by Harvard's Business School, and we can just read the executive summary of it. And what this is, they looked at they're just looking at Massachusetts. So Massachusetts has 37,000 miles of public roads, and then also has adjacent parking spaces, 4.5 million private passenger vehicles and light trucks. And then they found that the total annual cost of the vehicle economy is approximately $64 billion. So kind of compare that to the cost of creating the high-speed rail system in California was $128 billion, which is a lot. That's a lot. But this is every year you're paying $64 billion in Massachusetts. Um, that's not the cost to like build out the roads. I mean, that costs way more. This is just to maintain the system. And if you look at it, the public costs are 55% and the consumer costs are 45%. So let's look at the pie graph of how they figured this out. Okay, so consumer vehicle owning. So the owner of the vehicle is paying about $27 billion. Okay, all the owners. This is like car payments, insurance payments, gas, fueling costs, maintenance costs, all that stuff. That's 27 billion. Then they say that the cost of residential parking is $1 billion. And they take that to mean that's not how much you're paying yourself to park your car in your driveway, but the value of that land, the driveway and the garage, and the cost you're paying to build that garage and driveway and carport and all that stuff and maintain that across Massachusetts is about $1 billion. Then greenhouse gases. So this is the thing. Like if you don't believe in climate change, you can just cut that out. 1.2 billion. So that's not a huge portion of this. Pollution, 1.1 billion, and that is probably a gross underestimation, honestly. Then consumer parking subsidy, congestion, injuries and death, parking land value, road land value, state operating maintenance back, all this stuff. And then if you add all that up, $64 billion for 4.5 vehicles. If you divide this by 4.5, you get about 14,000. And then if you multiply 14,000 by the United States, 280 million, then you get about $4 trillion a year. So the cost to America is about $4 trillion a year, and about a little more than half of that will be borne by society, by non-owners of the car. So everyone is paying into it, not just the people that own the cars. So you can never own a car, be a non-car owner, and you're still paying you're paying half of the $4 trillion a year. And this cost is probably a little bit higher because Massachusetts is a very small state and they don't have that many roads, and lots of the country is a lot more spread out and the roads are more spread out, and it's a lot more land use. So this may be a low estimate of the costs. This another way of looking at it. Someone else looked at if you look at it this way, this is direct cost. This is how much a consumer pays. This is per year, $10,000 per car. And then indirect cost, this is like road costs not covered by road tax, free parking, policing, sprawl, lost quality of life cost. That's 7 million. They're not taking into account like the value of the land or the road and that kind of stuff. That's why this one looks like the societal costs are less than the personal costs. But even if you look at this, that's $20,000 per vehicle. That's a higher estimate than the $14,000 per vehicle that the Massachusetts study had. And if you use this, you're probably pushing closer to $4.5 trillion a year. So the United States is probably spending, somewhere between $4 to $5 trillion a year to maintain its car culture. So if you look at that, then these public transit costs seem a lot more reasonable when you kind of factor in all these things that can be largely mitigated by public transit things. And then if you look at these costs, what are the things that the Aptera would do better? So I think that vehicular crashes, Aptera is a very light car. It's less dangerous to other vehicles. So it is going to cost less mortality in crashes. and less damage in crashes. Like the Hummer EV is going to just be way more dangerous to everyone else on the road than an Aptera is going to be. And the air pollution, obviously, way far less in an Aptera. During operation, very little. Depending on where you're getting your charging from, if you're getting all from solar, like during operation, zero air pollution. If you're getting it from a fairly clean grid, a very little air pollution. And even if you're getting from like a coal-powered grid, it's very energy efficient. It's probably way less air pollution than a internal combustion vehicle is. Climate change, obviously much better. Noise pollution, this one is probably, I would say, pretty similar to another vehicle. I mean, it's lighter, so lighter vehicle is going to have less road noise in general, because it has less tire noise. Because it's aerodynamic, it's going to have far less wind noise. So in that case, it's going to be much better. Um, the engine noise, usually at high speeds, is pretty a small factor in the noise pollution. Probably most of the noise of cars at highway speeds is road noise with the tire, and then wind noise. And so Aptera probably has like half the wind noise. So it's gonna mitigate a lot of these costs. Of course, I stand by the best form of transportation is going to be walking or cycling. Second best is probably going to be public transportation. And then, but if you have to have a vehicle, and in America, it's very hard to function without a private vehicle, Aptera is going to be by far and away the best in terms of cost to both yourself and to society. All right, so hopefully that was an interesting uh, discussion for you guys. I think we just neglect to think about the cost of the status quo when we look at these public infrastructure projects. We have to understand that the status quo is not cheap and it's not free, and we have to kind of analyze these things based on the idea that the status quo, our car culture, is quite expensive, between $4 and $5 trillion a year in the United States. All right, thanks for watching, guys, and have a great day.